Welcome to the Transatlantic, a podcast produced by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Each episode, we will talk to people behind the debates and developments shaping the struggle for freedom and security here in the United States, Europe, Central Asia, and around the world. These conversations will cross oceans, intellectual divides, and political affiliations. We'll look forward to having you along for the ride. My name is Bakhtin Nishanov, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Commission, and I will be your host. I'm really happy to have two legends. First, we have Wayne Merry, is a senior fellow for Europe and Eurasia at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. In 26 years in the United States Foreign Service, he worked as a diplomat and political analyst specializing in Soviet and post-Soviet political issues, including 6 years at the American Embassy in Moscow, where he was in charge of political analysis on the breakup of the Soviet Union and the early years of post-Soviet Russia. He also served at the embassies in Tunis, East Berlin, Athens, U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York. In Washington, he served in the Treasury, State, and Defense Departments. In the Pentagon, he served as the regional director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia during the mid-90s. He also served at the headquarters of the U.S. Marine Corps and on Capitol Hill with the staff of the U.S. Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is our commission. He was later a program director at the Atlantic Council of the United States. We're also very pleased to have Ambassador James Collins. He's an expert on the former Soviet Union and its successor states and the Middle East. Ambassador Collins was the U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001. Before his appointment as ambassador to Russia, he served as ambassador at large and special advisor to the Secretary of State for the newly independent states in the mid-90s and the deputy chief of mission in Chargé at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 1990 to 1993, exactly when the Soviet Union was falling apart. In addition to these 3 diplomatic postings in Moscow, he also had positions at the U.S. embassies in Amman, general consulate in Izmir, Turkey, and he is the recipient of a Secretary of State's Award for Distinguished Service, the Department of State's Most Distinguished Honor Award, the Secretary of State's Award for Career Achievement, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and the NASA Medal for Distinguished Service. We need to talk about the NASA one. That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for being here. I know folks do not join the Foreign Service to become famous, but in this round, you two are rock stars, at least to us, people who engage and work on Russia and post-Soviet space. You are the 2 names that I think always come up, and it's a great honor to have you both here today, not only one, but both of you. And I'm hoping it's going to be a conversation, as we stated out, to how can we engage with Russia, and what are the mistakes, errors that seemingly we keep making when engaging and talking to Russia? How do we bring them about? Or is there something fundamentally wrong that with Russia, with this current administration of Russia, that is not allowing them to become a member of international order and become a good member at that too? So if I may, I'm just going to start with questions. And Ambassador, I think I'm going to start with you. So you served as ambassador to Russia from 1997 to 2001. What were the greatest lessons? I mean, 97, 2001, the 90s, the what Putin referred to as crazy times, as violent times. What were the lessons learned? What advice would you offer U.S. officials who are currently engaging with Russia, who are trying to engage with Russia, and are there any parallels between what was happening then and what's happening now?
Well, I think there's one fundamental point I took away from my career at serving in Russia, and as I've thought about it since, it hasn't really changed much. And that is that Russia sees itself, and with some justification, I might add, as a great power. One of the world's great powers. And it sees itself as that both while it was the Soviet Union, for sure, the other power in the Cold War, but also since. It sees itself as one of the world's great powers. And one of the things about the end of the Soviet Union that I think no one in the United States fully accepted or perhaps understood was that Russia never saw itself as the loser of a war. We kept talking about the Cold War like it was a war. The Russians saw it rather as them, a great power, the other great power of the Cold War, or of the 20th century's second half, certainly, having made a decision that the Soviet communist Marxist-Leninist system was over. It was no longer relevant, and they needed to change it. They wanted to become a member of the global system, but they certainly never thought they lost a war. Mm-hmm. Rather, they saw themselves as changing their system, but they fully expected to stay as the other great power. And nobody, by the way, in this point was talking about China. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't discussed. The Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Russians, from their point of view, after the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, see it as between Moscow and Washington. And Beijing, well, it's there, but it's not the decider. The United States, by contrast, saw the model, I think, of war as World War II. And therefore, in a sense, the sense in Washington I had more and more as I talked with people or people would come, was that, well, we're dealing now with a country like we dealt with Japan or Germany after World War II, that lost a war, needs to be reorganized and restructured, and we're going to get on with the business.
That's fascinating, yeah.
Now, the Russians, to a certain extent, accepted the idea that we had the model they thought they needed to adopt, or at least in great part, particularly the economic side of it. But they never thought they were not the other great power with a great civilization and a great history and a position that entitled them, and indeed made them, the other voice that would shape the future of the Euro-Atlantic world, if not global systems. So I think the real problem we have, and we still have it, is that we don't accept the idea that Russia is a great power. In a sense, we sort of start from the premise that they lost a war and they don't understand it. That was what dominated the 90s and on into the next decade to a degree. Mr. Putin, I think, unlike Yeltsin, his predecessor, who was willing to kind of put up with a lot of this, but was getting also very, I would say, fed up with the idea that he was simply ignored in certain things. And the biggest instance of that was the bombing of Serbia. When Mr. Putin came back to his second term in 2012, he more or less decided that the Americans are hopeless. They are never going to accept us as a great power if we work with them. So we simply have to decide we're going to show them we are in our own way. And the decision at that point was we are going to go our own way. We are no longer going to be just part of the West. That's what we're dealing with today. Now, we can talk about how do you deal with this, but I think this is the fundamental issue. We continue to try to make Russia behave by compelling it to do things. They see themselves as a great power who are not about to be compelled.
They make their own rules.
They make their own rules, and they're going to have their own interests, and they're going to pursue them.
That's fascinating, and we'll get back to that in a second, but just continuing with this theme of the 90s, Mr. Mary, you are the author of The Long Telegram, the famous, infamous, which actually was only now publicly available only since last year, 2024, right? Yes. Before that, it was, I understand you couldn't even access it yourself.
That's right.
And can you tell us a little bit about The Long Telegram? And again, I grew up in a post-Soviet space, so I grew up there, and actually reading the things that, especially in 2025, it's just incredible to me how many things you actually saw coming. That Long Telegram, if people are, our listeners and people who may be watching this are not aware of this, just Google it. incredible read. And I would like to sort of a little bit pick your brain about why you wrote it. And did you really believe that this would change the U.S., the path that U.S. chose to engage with the new independent Russia and post-Soviet space?
Oh, I was never foolish enough to imagine that anything that I wrote individually sitting at the embassy in Moscow was going to affect anything that Washington did. To some extent, I really simply wanted to say that, damn it, I told you so. And here we are 30 years later doing precisely that.
Yeah.
But large part of it had to do with what I considered then, and in retrospect consider to be kind of our biggest problem in dealing not just with Russia, but with many countries, and I've heard this from my years at the UN, is that you Americans never listen. And I know that when Bill Burns presented his credentials as ambassador in Moscow, Putin said to him, the big problem with you Americans is you never listen. And during the early 90 years, I was very focused on something that I had learned because I had been a graduate student at Princeton where I met Ambassador Kennan. And Ambassador Kennan, of course, wrote a lot about U.S.-Russia relations in the pre-Soviet and Soviet period. And the fact that we had the same problem in 1917. The Tsar was overthrown, and the Wilson administration believed, oh, now the Russians are going to become like us. They're going to establish a liberal democracy like ours, and getting rid of the Tsar is going to make them a more energetic ally in the war against Germany. Whereas in point of fact, the revolution for the Russian people was all about getting the hell out of that war and going home. So we started sending weaponry to Russia, not understanding it was going to fall into the hands of what became very quickly a civil war. But we insisted on seeing post-Tsarist Russia in terms of our own agenda. Rather than, in fact, that what was going on there was the breakup of a imperial structure, along with that of Austria-Hungary and the Wilhelmine in Germany, in a great war, of which we only became a participant toward the very end. When the Cold War, as we saw it, came to an end, we also didn't listen. What was this all about for them? And I remember one of the things that in going around to demonstrations and events in Moscow and in other cities in this immediate post-Soviet period was a slogan I heard again and again, which was, no more experiments. That people were fed up with Leninism as a great kind of a social, political, cultural, economic, historical experiment. And what people in Russia wanted was to live normal lives, normalno. What a lot of people in Washington had this notion, yes, they just lost a war, we just won the Cold War, and now it's up to us to help them transform themselves into something like us. At that time, there was in American political culture a concept that had been floating around for a few years called the end of history. Francis Fukuyama's article and then later his book. And while even a lot of people didn't use that phrase or had never read the article or the book, that notion that somehow the end of the Warsaw Pact, German unification, the breakup of the Soviet Union was a historical transformation of a kind that was going to be essentially global and permanent. And again, no talk about China. Fukuyama never talked about China. He never talked about the Muslim world, which had basically defined the world for the last 30 years. But we had this notion that somehow there was a unipolar world. It was dominated by us, not American hegemony, of which I think just about everybody in the world recognized that in the post-Second World War world, the United States had the status of a hegemon in many areas. First and foremost in culture, but then in many parts of the economy and technology and politics. But now we were actually going to behave not so much as a hegemon, but almost as a global suzerain. And if you look at some of the things that were said there, global benign hegemony, so forth, these were things that were not only very disturbing to many of our allies and friends, they were, of course, totally unacceptable to a country like Russia, which saw itself as a emerging democracy, but a democracy that would still be Russian. You very quickly use phrases like managed democracy. And above all, they didn't like the way they were treated. And I remember, this may have actually been when Jim was in Moscow, there was because it had to do with Serbia, where Boris Yeltsin told President Bill Clinton, Russia's weak now, but we won't always be weak, and we will remember. And if there's any single person who is good at remembering humiliation, it's got to be Vladimir Putin.
This is absolutely fascinating. Let me ask you a follow-up question, and then Ambassador Collins, I would like your opinion on that too. The one theme that is emerging from both of you is that they're in Washington for years. I mean, for a century, more than a century. You were talking about the fall of the Tsarist Russia. There is wishful thinking about Russia, or maybe is it wishful thinking, or is it just complete misunderstanding on part of policymakers about what Russia is and how you engage with it? In the 90s, seemingly there was this just optimism. Well, of course they're going to come around. They look at our shelves in our stores and look at the shelves in their stores. Of course they will see us as a model and they're going to come around. Why do you think? I mean, it seems like it's not just one. It wasn't just in the 90s. I mean, you were talking about the earlier 20th century. Why do you think this constant wishful thinking or misunderstanding about Russia is just so continuous, so strong?
Well, America is an optimistic society and an optimistic culture.
Yeah.
And many times I've heard from people from other countries, Russia included, that and on the one hand, they kind of admire this. On the other hand, it frustrates them enormously because we tend to fall into problems of lack of realism. I think one of the things about Russia is that coming out of the 19th century, in the United States, Russia had made itself very popular in the North during the Civil War because it had supported the Union and Lincoln. Now, it did it in part because it was worried about getting into another war with the British and the French, and the Tsar wanted to move his navy to safe ports, and so they sent the Russian Navy to northern ports during the American Civil War, supposedly as a demonstration of political support, but really just to protect their own ships. But what this meant was that, at least in the North, Russia came out of the American Civil War smelling like roses. Yeah. And that remarkably endured. I mean, if you read Mark Twain's writings, you find out how positive was this notion that Russia was going to be like us. I mean, they freed the serfs, we freed the slaves, and people would read these passages in Tocqueville, in which he would say that the two great nations of the future are Russia and America. And we had, I don't know how many times that notion in Tocqueville, was written in the 1830s, would come up in discussions of Americans about Russia. Then came this moment when the Tsar, who was regarded in very negative terms in the United States, when his regime fell. And then we all thought, now they're going to really get to be like us. And if I have a bound volume of the Atlantic Monthly from 1917, and you read the articles, they read just like articles you could read in the Atlantic Monthly in the early 1990s. The exact same lack of realism. I mean, that says a lot more about us than it does about them.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about.
My personal favorite quote in that regard about Russia is from Bismarck, who spent a lot of time in Russia, and he said that Russia is never either as strong as it appears or as weak as it appears. And I think that says a lot about us, because for us, our problems in our Russia policy are about how we perceive Russia, not the reality of Russia, strength or weaknesses, but as Bismarck warned, it's how you think about the country is how it appears to you. And we have either a very optimistic view of Russia, which we've had a number of times. I know I was caught up in it myself in the early 90s. You could not be if you were actually there.
Yeah.
But then the notion that doesn't take very long that, oh, well, they're hopeless, there's nothing we can do with this country, we just need to ignore them, as if somehow you can't.
Fascinating. Ambassador, one thing that this is not at all to challenge, but I think just to think about it, is even if Russia was not perceived as a great power in the United States, they thought of themselves, you said, as a great power. But with great power comes great responsibility. And Russia, over the last 20 years at the very least, has not been the most responsible world power. I would argue. But of course, I would love to hear your opinion on that. And you also said that punishment through sanctions and such is not going to work with Russians. How would we go about it? How would we? There are certain things that are just universal. It's not just about the United States. It's not just about Ukraine. I mean, we're gonna get into Ukraine, but it's about how you behave. It's some certain commitments that Russia took upon themselves that are not. They're just not implementing them. So if they are not acting responsibly, and we can go all the way back to 2008 in Estonia, those cyber attacks and spreading misinformation, they've really made it into art and science. How do we go about engaging with folks who might think of themselves as a great power, but they're certainly not acting that way? And how do we sort of compel them to compel? This is not probably the word you want to hear, but how do we encourage them, nudge them to do the right thing? And this is a question to both of us, but maybe Ambassador, you may want to take this question, and then I would love to hear your opinion on that as well.
The place one has to start is essentially to agree that you're negotiating with another power that admittedly may be, in our view, misbehaving. I don't contest that, right? But the question you're asking is, how do you get them to behave in ways that are mutually acceptable?
Right.
And I think one then has to talk about this with them as another great power who can do this. I mean, can misbehave and get away with it if we don't find an alternative.
Yeah.
And, up to now, we have decided that there's rules and we're enforcing them. Well, the events of yesterday or day before, when we dropped some rather large bombs on a foreign country, says, well, the rules are okay, but, there are challenges, there are difficulties. I mean, in short, we're going to have to deal with these issues and negotiations and decide what it is. What are the trade-offs? How do you give incentives to the Russian side to think in terms like we do about X, Y, or Z behavior because it benefits? If you can't get it done, well, then certain things will not happen.
Yeah.
But the idea that we can compel it, to me, has simply proved itself unsuccessful.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the question is, what's the alternative? Because I think you asked the right question. And the one we don't seem to be trying is how we're going to do this. But I think you're curious what Wayne's has to say.
I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, my background in dealing particularly with Russia has always essentially been as a student rather than engagement. I never really was involved in very much diplomacy with Russia, and that mostly when I was in the Pentagon working for Secretary of Defense Perry, who had a remarkable capacity of reaching out to people in Moscow to discuss with them things in which there were potential mutual benefits. And we did a lot of that. What I don't see in our sanctions regime is very much in the way of potential mutual benefit for their side, and often not very much for our side. I mean, when you come down to it, the habit of economic sanctions in the United States goes back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison during the War of 1812. And we weren't very successful with them then. The thing about sanctions is they're the things that you do when you feel politically you have to do something, but you don't want to do anything in which you could actually get you hurt. In other words, you don't want to go to war. And we have now developed sanctions regimes that are enormously complex. And that the Russians also believe, based on their experience during the Cold War, that are forever. That our sanctions would never be revoked. And in many cases, that would require congressional action, which is almost unthinkable. So much of the sanctions regimes that we have vis-a-vis Russia today are ones that we're going to be living with forever, effectively. You have to plan, and the Russians, essentially plan on them being forever. They keep, every once in a while they say that, we'll talk about such and such, but that will require you to revoke your sanctions. Sure. But unfortunately, they know perfectly well that this president or any other president would have very great difficulty in making that happen. One thing I would just like to point out is that in the last 30-odd years, another truly great power has emerged in the world, and that's China. Yeah. And the Russians didn't expect that. I actually wrote a short book about how this came as a really big surprise to them. But one of the things the Chinese have been very conscientious about doing is treating their Russian neighbors with respect, at least overt respect. Now, I know from some of my own contacts with the Chinese that their private attitude toward the Russians is often very adversarial. But they see absolutely no benefit in having an adversarial relationship with this enormous northern and western neighbor. So to a large extent, the Chinese have created a situation in which they are partners with the Russians when they see it as being beneficial. And when they don't see it as beneficial, they simply do nothing. And that works just fine for China, while we are becoming adversarial to both countries. This leading to the interesting situation of how did the one superpower go about pushing two other near superpowers into essentially a partnership, and was that really in our benefit? I can remember very well when Iran regarded Russia as an anathema, and you couldn't imagine Iran and Russia being partners. Well, now they are. I think a question out there is, to what extent do you want to isolate any country? But we're not talking about Russia. To isolate Russia is a very big job when you're talking about what is, I would say, a permanent country, a country that's always been there, as far as we're concerned, and always will be there.
Just to talk about Ukraine and Russian war against Ukraine, I think while politically, obviously, and historically there are complexities, I think there's no arguing that this is a violent war that Russia is unleashing on Ukrainian civilians mostly. Watching the missile strike on Kyiv apartment on June 17th, which, among others, killed an American citizen, it's horrendous. But I would love to hear both of your opinions. It's happening. So the understanding the complexities and understanding sort of the, I think, hopefully objective reality of unacceptability of this war, or how Russia is waging it against Ukrainian civilians, knowing based on your experience and history of engaging with Russia and Soviet Union, how do we stop this? What is the formula? And obviously there's no universal algorithm that is going to get us to that. But what would you do, both of you, if you were in charge? And I know this is the most difficult question, but I do think it's a fair question given your experience and direct negotiations with Putin. I'm sure when you were ambassador, you met him on multiple occasions. And I think Putin from early 2000s is a different person from today's Putin. But nonetheless, if you were in charge, how do we go about it? How do we end this on conditions that are acceptable to Ukraine and Ukrainians?
Well, as it happens, I'm going to be going back to Ukraine in a few days, accompanying some Senate staffers. And I've been to Ukraine many, many times. In fact, originally, I was going to be the number 2 person in an American consulate in Kiev in 1980. But Soviet invasion of Afghanistan caused the Jimmy Carter administration to cancel that project. But I've been to Ukraine many, many times, both in its Soviet identity and after that. And without any question, I have been aware of a Ukrainian national identity, which has become, if anything, very intense, courtesy of Russian military action against Ukraine. If any person is the godfather of a Ukrainian national identity, it's Vladimir Putin. Now, I'm sure that's not what he had in mind. But I can tell you, having traveled a good deal in Ukraine in this century, it is a place that really does think of itself not as just having a place on the map and a seat at the United Nations, but as being, in its own way, a growing great power in terms of national culture. They certainly think of themselves as being on the same order of international stature, say, as Poland or Spain, and maybe even Germany. Russia, now that's a different question. Now, one of the things that I find a little striking about Putin's policies towards Ukraine is I get the sense that he's rarely ever actually had any Ukrainian mud on his shoes. I don't think he's actually, in his entire life, spent more than a few days there, and I doubt that he actually has ever really been a genuine guest in a Ukrainian home.
Wow.
I have been many times, but I think I've probably got, even though I've never lived there, I think I've probably got more Ukrainian mud on my shoes than Putin does. And if you read his various statements, some of which were written for him, but all of which he delivered, and I take him seriously, or if you listen to what he said just a few days ago at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, it is a clear denial that Ukraine has a legitimate national identity. It is a rejection not only of what his own government at the end of the Soviet Union signed in terms of agreements with the new Ukrainian state, and treaties that I admit took a long time to negotiate, but are treaties, are essentially rejecting them. Now, I think that any government in Kiev to reach any kind of an agreement with this government in Moscow is going to have to make some very, very painful concessions, and that how they do that is not going to be easy, and it's going to require a good deal of nudging from its European partners and from its American partner. But you're never going to get an agreement here that does not require a fundamental acceptance by the Russian government, whoever is in charge of that government at the time, that Ukraine is a nation state, and it holds its seat in New York legitimately. And I'm afraid that is actually, regardless of where you draw the lines on the map, the acceptance that Ukraine is not an oblast, it is a nation state, is a fundamental requirement, and I don't see that that's one on which any Ukrainian government is going to be able to make any fundamental agreement with Moscow that does not involve that concession from the Russian side.
What is, given everything, given the context, what is the United States' role then in this process? What are we doing enough? We're not doing enough. What should we be doing more of? What should we not be doing or engaging on? This is obviously a fascinating intellectual conversation, but also the policy implications of this are really, really broad. What do we do? How do we? Maybe we just let them figure it out. Do we not engage? Or again, is the level of engagement that we currently have, is that enough? I know it's a very unfair question, but again, given the scope and breadth of your experiences, I do think it would be unfair not to ask this question. Hopefully, tens of millions of people who are watching this will benefit from this, and we will inform U.S. policy. But I genuinely, an honest question, and hoping for an honest answer.
Well, I guess what I would say is, it seems to me that what's totally lacking at the moment, if in response to this question, is what's in it for the Russians or the Ukrainians to stop. I mean, okay, we know, for the Ukrainians, maybe it's a bit simpler in the sense that they have fewer people being killed or the horrors of war and so on and so on. But I mean, essentially, if I'm sitting in either Kiev or Moscow and saying, well, if we do stop, what's it going to mean about our American relations? I have no idea that the American-Russian relationship has any positive future. I mean, as Wayne pointed out, they justifiably have some doubts about the ability to remove sanctions. But even more to the point, what's in it for them to stop? Now, I have some theories about that, or some ideas about what you could make as the alternative idea. But right now, the only thing that's out there is that if you stop, you stop. And Ukraine, similarly, I mean, stopping the war right now is an incentive obviously worth pursuing, because you stop people getting killed in the numbers they are. On the other hand, if it requires getting all the land back, which every leader seems to say, although I think they know they won't, what is the plus side out of that, including from us? What is Ukraine going to get out of this from Europe or the United States if it comes to terms with the Russians? And something. So I think one of the things I would say about our posture right now is that we're real good about how bad it is of the Russians to do what they're doing, and how awful it is for the Ukrainians to be suffering, and how we need to support them. But we have no sense about what is it we think the world ought to look like, or could look like, from our point of view and our relations with these two entities, if it stops and you get an agreement on a peace. And I would submit that the Russians essentially have no particular incentive. And the Ukrainian side similarly, well, they have an incentive to get it stopped, but not at any price. Is the problem. Now, I will just give you my one hobby horse thought. That east of the Ural Mountains now, 6 time zones, there are 30 million people. And there's everything on the periodic table in abundance. And the Russians are not capable of developing it. And that's something we ought to think about. Not that we're going to take it over, but that if you're looking for cooperation in the future as a common interest potentially, it seems to me that's a big one, potentially. Not necessarily just with us, but I mean, because the problem then is there is that third great power below that area.
Well, myself, unusually for somebody whose profession was the diplomatic service, I tend to be one of those Americans who think that my country ought to be doing less in the world, taking on fewer responsibilities and being willing to put down burdens rather than just take them up. I'm the author of 7 or 8 published articles on why the United States should get out of NATO. And I've spoken on that topic, including at NATO institutions, many times, that I thought that with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of what we call the Cold War, it was high time for the United States to say, mission accomplished, you Europeans can now take over the responsibility for your continent and your region, including how you engage with Russia. I think that would have been a very interesting last 30 years if the Russian relationship with the West had been overwhelmingly with Europe and not with the United States. The United States had sort of shifted its focus more to the Asia-Pacific region earlier. But here we are. The United States came out of the 20th century as essentially a global hegemon. Simply because the losses and destructions in the Second World War were so massive. And so we now still live in a world that's dominated by the Yankee dollar. We're still in a world in which it's not so much Washington, it's New York and Los Angeles that are the poles of the world in terms of finance, in terms of economics, in terms of technology, in terms of culture. And this is an extraordinary thing that makes the United States different from Russia, different from China, different from just about everybody else. And this is something that young people pretty much understand all over the world. But does that require the United States to be an imperial power with a focus on military capacity and military activities? Well, it's quite clear that the American people got very fed up with Afghanistan and with Somalia and with Syria and with Iraq. And I have a feeling they're going to get pretty fed up with the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf as well. And this is a situation in which I think the question is, not that will the United States be the leading country in the world. It is, and it's going to be, if only because the question is, where do talented young people want to go? Well, it ain't Russia.
Yeah.
It's America. But then you have a situation as to what extent the Americans, whether they were born here or whether they came here, want to carry certain burdens out there in the world. Yeah. And I think the last decade or so indicates that the impatience of the American public with being not just the hegemon, but essentially, the godfather for so many other things in the world has gotten that patience has gotten very thin. And I'm bound to say that as I get older, I share that.
This is absolutely fascinating. At least, people who are listening or watching will not accuse us of lack of intellectual honesty and integrity, hopefully, right? Because we stand for certain things, but we genuinely appreciate your expertise and your thoughts on this. And the last bit, just 30 seconds maybe each. Again, as I mentioned before, I'd grown up in the then collapsing Soviet Union. I grew up in Uzbekistan, and in the late 80s, early 90s. Obviously, watching from that side was one thing, but I would love to hear what was the most unexpected thing? 1991, all of a sudden this country that for 75 years everybody feared in the United States, it's gone. What was the most unexpected, unusual thing? And then you going there in the 90s, what was the thing that you did not expect to see that sort of was like, oh wow, this is not what I thought it would be like? Or on the other, it could be positive or negative. As it was falling apart, you were there. You were in charge of our embassy there. What was the kind of a big takeaway, one unexpected thing that that kind of blew your mind a little bit?
Well, I think, without question, the one thing that nobody expected and which I happened to have as my responsibility because I was Chargé, the ambassador was gone, was the coup.
Yeah.
When I went out to Moscow as DCM, I went around town for all my briefings and so forth, and I was told that the considered judgment of the intelligence community was that within 5 years, one of the Soviet republics probably one of the Baltic republics, was attain a substantial degree of autonomy. Well,
5 years, only one.
yeah, well, and autonomy.
Yeah.
Okay, and within months
Yeah.
of the coup, there was no Soviet Union.
It was a whole thing came apart.
And I mean that. I think if you will, that was one constant shock.
Yeah.
And no less for anyone at the embassy than for any Soviet citizen.
Yeah.
And it was quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well, I was also there, and I had just come from having been briefed in Washington, where nobody anticipated even remotely what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And at the White House, I was actually told, oh, you're going out to Moscow. Oh, it's too bad you're going now because all the interesting changes have already taken place. And Gorbachev has done all he can do, and the Soviet Union is in for a prolonged period of stagnation and drift. And of course, within the next 6 months, it was all gone. But if there's anything that really astonished me, is that it happened so bloodlessly. That you can count the number of bodies. 3. There were 3. And what really struck me was how responsibly the organs of state power, which was to say the military, the KGB, and all of the other uniformed and non-uniformed instruments of the state, simply let the communist Leninist system die. And even though they had it within their capacity to prolong it if they chose, they didn't. And to me, the one thing that I did not think would happen is that the Soviet Union would fall apart, not entirely peacefully. I mean, there were problems in Moldova and in Tajikistan and other places, but that you did not have a continent-sized Yugoslavia, which could very well have happened and wouldn't have surprised anybody if it had been a continental-sized Yugoslavia. And the fact that it wasn't, I always give a lot of tribute to the guys in uniform who behaved very, very responsibly, and nobody ever gives them credit, but I do.
I agree with that. I would second exactly what Wayne is saying, that it fell apart, in essence, peacefully. Was little short of a miracle, but it was the responsibility, I think, of Russians and all of the others, essentially saying, we don't want to kill each other over this. We want to make our way in a new life. And they were ready for it.
Oh yeah, they were definitely ready for it.
And in that sense, it was its time.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, your thoughts, and your insights and your expertise. This has been an incredible conversation. I loved it, and hopefully people who listen and watch, they will enjoy it as well. Thank you for being here, and we'll pick it up maybe again on because there's so much to explore. Maybe we'll come together again for a round 2. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.